Gears of War is back, with Gears 5 truncating the name and tightening up the package as a whole. I love that Microsoft has committed to releasing all first-party games simultaneously on both Xbox and PC. Even more impressive is that you can buy Gears 5 on Steam. Score 1 for user choice. It will even work on Windows 7 if you buy the Steam version, though I've tested the Microsoft Store release. I also have to give Microsoft and the Coalition props for doing a good job at optimizing the game. Even during the early access phase, performance was good, and going back and retesting the game several weeks later, I don't see any major changes. That's particularly praiseworthy considering the state of Borderlands 3, which also uses Unreal Engine 4. That doesn't mean you can just max out the settings and resolution on every GPU, of course, and Gears 5 provides a plethora of settings to tweak so that you can get the best performance possible. No, seriously, it's almost too many settings. There are 25 different advanced settings, and many have a negligible impact on image quality and performance. If you want to know what each setting does and how much it's likely to affect performance, whether that's your CPU, GPU, or VRAM, Gears provides helpful descriptions along with a preview mode to compare image quality. I started at the Ultra preset and then used the built-in benchmark to test with each individual setting at minimum to generate these charts. Of the settings, dynamic shadow quality is the most demanding option to increase, with world texture detail, tessellation quality, texture filtering, and depth of field being other items you may want to tweak. The cumulative effect of turning down a bunch of settings ends up being greater than the individual items, however, so the low preset, for example, more than doubles performance relative to Ultra. All of the laptops, graphics cards, and motherboards used in testing today were provided by our hardware partner MSI. I tested Gears 5 across a suite of modern AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, along with AMD and Intel integrated graphics. I also checked performance with a range of modern CPUs using the fastest consumer GPU available, the RTX 2080 Ti. For mobile gamers, MSI provides 3 different gaming laptops that I tested, using the mobile RTX 2060, 2070 Max-Q, and 2080. Gears 5, as noted, includes a built-in benchmarking tool that provides all sorts of useful performance metrics. However, the built-in benchmark has a problem where the first 10 seconds or so may run very slowly on some settings, particularly when the hardware and settings you're using will hit very high frame rates. It's pretty obvious when something is wrong, as you'll see performance scale from around 40 frames per second at the start up to perhaps 200 frames per second or more after 10 seconds. If that happens, just pause the benchmark and restart and you'll get a clean run. That's how all of my testing was performed, and I also set the Windows desktop resolution to the desired resolution using 100% scaling. Otherwise, the resolution can also impact performance. But enough chit-chat. Let's hit the benchmarks, starting at 720p low using integrated graphics. Unfortunately, there's no way to hide the performance metrics in the top left corner of the built-in benchmark. These background videos were captured using an RTX 2080 Ti, but I also collected individual frame types on the various GPUs using NVIDIA's FrameView utility. These overlays you see at the bottom are accurate, so just ignore the stats up in the top left. The quick takeaway is that while AMD's Vega 11 breezes past 60 FPS at 720p low and can even manage around 40 FPS at 1080p low, Intel's HD Graphics 630 is basically dead in the water. It's unplayable. 10, 12 frames per second? No. There's no resolution scaling option below 720p either, so this is as good as it gets, assuming things don't improve with an updated driver at some point. Switching to 1080p and sticking with the low preset, the 4 budget to mid-range GPUs shown here don't struggle at all, with even the 1650 breaking 100 FPS. Gears 5 lists a GTX 1050 or RX 560 as the minimum requirement, and both are able to break 60 FPS, though just barely in the case of the RX 560. But really, as long as you're not on Intel's HD 630 or earlier integrated graphics, you should be able to play Gears 5, and mid-range and higher GPUs will also be able to max out refresh rates on a 144Hz monitor. Stepping up to 1080p medium drops performance around 35% on most GPUs, with only the fastest cards showing a smaller dip. That's a pretty big jump in requirements, but the mid-range GPUs I'm testing all sail past 60 without any difficulties. In fact, even the recommended GTX 970 and RX 570 make it past 60, along with the GTX 1650. Integrated graphics might be out, but otherwise the medium preset is a reasonable balance of image fidelity and performance, with the RX 5700 and above still breaking 144 FPS. 1080p high remains a relatively attainable goal, and the 1660 Ti and RX 590 are pretty much tied at around the 80 frames per second mark. Interestingly, and this is perhaps due to DirectX 12, the drop in performance compared to medium quality is around 18% on most GPUs, but the newer Turing NVIDIA GPUs show a more significant 25 to 30% drop on the GTX 16 series and the RTX 2060 cards. Perhaps it's just VRAM coming into play, though even the old GTX 970 only drops 18%. Because DX12 is a lower-level API, it's up to game developers to optimize for different architectures, and it seems like the 6GB Turing GPUs could benefit from additional tuning. Finally, maxing out quality with the Ultra preset starts to push beyond what mid-range GPUs can handle. The Vega 56 and GTX 1070 still sail past 60 FPS, but the 1660 Ti and RX 590 are right on the threshold, and the GTX 1060 and slower GPUs all fall below 60. 30 FPS is of course still playable, but there's enough action in Gears 5 that I prefer to keep frame rates above 60. The AMD and Nvidia GPUs continue to trade blows up to a certain point. The RX 5700 XT beats the 2070 and 1080 Ti and basically matches the far more costly Radeon 7, while the RX 5700 ties the RTX 2070. None of the GPUs can break 144 FPS, however, and only the 2080 Ti can break 120 FPS. Continuing the upward trend to 1440p Ultra, only a handful of GPUs average 60 FPS or more now. You basically need an RX 5700 or GTX 1080 or better, and the Vega 64, which I didn't test, should likely suffice as well. The high-end graphics cards shown here all clear 60 FPS, though minimum frame rates on the 2070 and 5700 can dip below that mark at times. By way of comparison, Borderlands 3 at 1440p Ultra runs about 10% slower than Gears 5, with only 3 cards breaking the 60 FPS mark. That's of course apples and oranges, even if both use Unreal Engine 4, but it's nice that the Coalition seems to have tuned things to allow for higher frame rates. Of course, optimized and optimized to run 4K Ultra at 60 FPS are not the same thing. Performance actually dropped a bit from my first testing at 4K, whether that's drivers or game patches I'm not sure, but where the 2080 Ti just barely averaged 60 FPS before, it now comes up just a hair short. Either way, minimum FPS was never going to be above 60, though dropping to the high preset will get you there. Or you could run 4K at minimum quality on cards like the GTX 1070. Personally, I'd look for a better balance between quality and resolution than running at 4K using the low preset. That takes care of graphics card testing, but how much does your CPU matter in Gears 5? I've tested with 8 different CPUs, all using an RTX 2080 Ti to find out. Starting with 1080p low quality gives the largest difference between the CPUs, with the Core i9 9900K beating the Ryzen 5 2600 and Core i3 8100 by 60%. An overclocked 8700K is nearly as fast as the 9900K at stock, or it ties the 3rd gen Ryzen 3900X and 3700X if all of those are running stock. Bumping up to 1080p high, the gap between the CPUs narrows a bit, but the i9 9900K still leads the slowest CPUs I tested by 50%. It seems both core counts, thread counts, and clock speeds matter here, though even the i3 8100 keeps minimums well above 60. Obviously, a slower graphics card would make differences in CPU far less important, which is basically what happens with the 2080 Ti at higher resolutions. While there's a 60% gap at 1080p low, at 1080p ultra quality, the difference between the fastest and slowest CPUs drops to just 30%. At 1440p, it shrinks to 8%, and 4K Ultra, as usual, is a virtual tie. There's a 3% difference in average frame rate and a slightly larger 5% difference in minimum FPS. What about gaming notebooks? I'm sticking with the high preset to keep minimums above 60. The 2070 Max-Q and Mobile 2060 are basically tied, with the 2070 Max-Q holding a slight 4% advantage at ultra quality. Again, given the two chips have the same TDP, I really can't recommend opting for the more expensive Max-Q models for most users. What's interesting is that at the low preset, all three laptops are basically tied, even though the GL63 has a 4-core 8-thread i5-8300H compared to the 6-core 12-thread i7-8750H on the GS75 and GE75. The GE75 is a hair faster at medium quality and then starts to pull away at high and ultra quality. You could probably even handle 1440p with the Mobile 2080, though obviously that would require using a different laptop or an external monitor. Ultimately, Gears 5 doesn't radically alter the narrative in the Gears of War universe, but it's a competent cover shooter that refines a few mechanics. Performance and system requirements follow a similar path. 3 years after the previous outing, Gears 5 comes along and bumps up the image quality and hardware requirements a few notches. If you want to play at 60 FPS, Gears 5 can get there at 1080p with just about any graphics card built in the past several years, but you'll need to tune your settings as appropriate. And if you're rocking a tricked out Extreme PC and want to game at 4K and 60 FPS, you can do that as well, though you'll need next year's hardware to get 4K Ultra at 60 FPS or more. Gears 5 is the Hollywood summer blockbuster of video games. It has some great set pieces that make you feel like the hero at the click of a few buttons, and it's a good popcorn flick while you wait for something else to come along. Fans of the series will find plenty to like, and newcomers, especially those on PC who may have missed several of the earlier Xbox-only releases, can still be entertained. Thanks as always to MSI for sponsoring our performance analysis articles and providing the hardware for our testing. Fall is here, and we have several more gaming benchmark bonanzas planned before the end of the year, so like and subscribe to get all of our latest videos. And as always, thanks for watching.